Good to see you. Good to have you here at the Journey this morning, especially if it is your first time here. I do want to hit one announcement, add one more to this. We are in week 1 of our prayer campaign, 21-day prayer campaign. And so I think we have about 118, 120 people that are signed up for that right now. If you haven't joined us yet, you can jump in for the 21-day or the 14-day campaign at this point, right? Text prayer 21 to that 703 number, and you'll get a quick response. Or maybe it might be quick. It may take us a little while, but it'll get to you. And then starting tomorrow morning, 7 a.m., you'll start getting those text reminders. We've been doing that this whole week and been having certain things to pray for. And so I hope you will jump into that. And then that also leads into our celebration that we are doing on August the 25th. August 25th from 6 to 7 p.m., we are doing a celebration service here, and so put that on your calendars. We hope that you will join us for that, but really excited for this prayer campaign that we are in. Question for you, how many of you, is this your favorite movie? Princess Bride? Just one person? Oh my gosh, you guys are like my kids. I love this movie, okay? It's like one of my favorite movies. It is a masterpiece. Whoever that was clapping right there. She's been like in the top 5. During COVID, I sat down with my kids because I was excited for them to watch it, and we watched it together at the end. I was like, hey, what'd you guys think? And they were like, meh. So after that terrible movie review, we made them do extra chores that week because that's not acceptable. But for the one person like myself who enjoys this movie, there's a couple of lines in it that are memorable. One of the main characters is the guy up in the right corner. It's Inigo Montoya. He has this line he says throughout. He says, hello, my name is Inigo Montoya. You killed my father. Prepare to die, right? There's a subplot in this movie that if you know it, then you know that that's a part of it, and he's looking for some revenge. But I think my favorite line in the whole movie, there's this one guy who keeps saying inconceivable, right? And if you've seen the movie, you know what I'm talking about. But Montoya says this to him. He says, you keep using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means. This morning, as we continue our summer fruit series, we're going to talk about a word that I don't think it means what we think it means. And that word we're going to focus on today is the word good. Have you ever thought how much we use that word? We use that word when we describe feelings or things, right? How are you doing? I'm good. How was dinner that you had last night? It was good. How was the movie you saw earlier this week? You know what? It was really good. We use good to describe feelings and things. But we also use it to describe people. He's a good kid. She's a really good leader. He's a good neighbor. So we describe people with that term, good. But we also describe God that way too. In fact, we sang a few songs this morning that describe the goodness of God, or that God is good. There's some of the songs I was singing the goodness of God. God, you are good. Or that last song we just did, you're a good, good Father. So we describe God with that term good also. Now, don't get me wrong. There's nothing wrong with describing people or things or feelings or even God with that term good. But do we really understand what that word means? I ask that question because in our society today, good is subjective. Think about this. We have a very diverse church. I love that about this church. We come from so many different places and backgrounds, socially, ethnically, economically, politically, religiously, and I love that about this place. But if I were to ask each one of you to give me a definition of what good is for you, we would have many varied responses to that. Now, thankfully, in our world today, each one of us get to decide what good is, right? So whatever good is in your eyes, then that's what good is. I get to define goodness for me. You get to define goodness for you. They get to define goodness for themselves. But when everybody is trying to define good on their own, what happens to goodness? Well, it begins to pit us against each other because each one of us have a different definition of what goodness is. And so it's this battle, right? It's my goodness versus your goodness versus their goodness versus my goodness. And so there's this constant battle of trying to define goodness for us. A great example of this, we're in the midst of the political season. And so there's TV ads that are on all the time. There's rallies that are taking place. I don't know about you, but it seems like I have some friends that I never knew I had named Sally and Tom who text me like once a week like, hey, how you been? Really missed you. I'm like, I have no clue who you are, but they're like, you got to support this candidate, and here's why, and you can do fundraising type of stuff, and all that mess, right? But I want you to think about the politics for just a second, because in the midst of this, what do we hear from candidates? I know what good is. I know what good is. But you know what? The other candidate, they don't know what good is. In fact, what they know is evil. Like my ideologies, my plans, they're good, but theirs aren't. And so for some people, you start to hear this over and over again, and then there's a person or a party or a platform who's defining goodness for us, and over time, as that seeps in, we begin to accept that as goodness for you and for me. But it's not just in the political world, it's in religious circles too. You know, my spiritual convictions or my theology is good. But their spiritual convictions, their theology, no, that's not good. And in fact, we oftentimes use it as a weapon in religious circles. And it becomes this, I'm good, I'm right, they're not, they're wrong, and they are evil. See, we take this word good and we define it in our own way. And so, whose good is right? Is my good right? Is your good right? Is their good right? I mean, whose good is the right definition of good? Well, good is so subjective in our world today. We truly don't understand what good is. So what is good? Well, to answer that question the best I can, we're going to go into this passage we've been focused on throughout this series. And if you're brand new, this is a passage out of Galatians chapter 5, verses 22 and 23. It's known as the fruit of the Spirit, and that's why we have the title for this series called Summer Fruit. But this passage was written by a guy named Paul. If you're not familiar with Paul, he was a pastor and a church planter, planted churches all throughout the Middle East and into parts of Asia. And he would do this. He'd write these letters back to a church or to groups of churches. And so the letter we have here in Galatians is actually to a group of churches in what is now present-day central part of Turkey. And he writes these words in Galatians chapter 5 in this letter. He says this, but the Holy Spirit produces this kind of fruit in our lives: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. And so Paul says, here's the deal. If God's Spirit is in you, it's producing fruit in you. And so you will become what I am listing here. And today, we are talking about this term, goodness. And one of the things we've said throughout this series is that when Paul uses a word, there's a meaning behind it. He is very specific in the terms that he uses here. And so when he uses this term goodness, it's probably not going to be the kind of definition we have for goodness. There's probably some deeper meaning for him. Now, Paul uses a Greek word we're going to put up here on the screen. It's this Greek word, agathosune. You don't need to memorize it or know it or anything like that. It's an interesting word. It's interesting because we don't see this word anywhere else in all of secular Greek language at that time. So this means this word may have been strictly used in a biblical sense. We only find it 3 other times in the New Testament. Between the 2nd and 3rd century BCE, there was a Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. We call that the Septuagint. And in that Greek translation of the Old Testament, we see it about a dozen times. So this word's not used very much. So for Paul to use it, there must have been something important behind it. And so let's kind of dive into the meaning of what this goodness is. And let's start here. This word that Paul uses means that goodness has a purpose. Joe Beers wrote this. He said, the truth, though, is that a call to goodness is not just a call to follow some rules and be a better person, The call to goodness is a total reversal of the fragmented, broken, incompetent start of the world as it currently stands. Look at the very first piece there. He says the purpose of goodness isn't to follow some rules and be a better person. He says the purpose of goodness is to transform and to change lives in a fragmented, in a broken, and in a messy world. And so when Paul uses that term goodness here, it's not subjective. This isn't Paul's idea of goodness. This isn't your idea of goodness. This isn't my definition of goodness. But this goodness that Paul is talking about, because of the word he uses, is saying that goodness has a purpose, that God's goodness has a purpose. John Tyson's a pastor in New York City and really helpful in this message today. And he said this, he said, goodness reflects God's purpose and intent for the world. Really, when we talk about God's goodness here, it takes us back to the creation story. If you're familiar with the creation story, you know the word good is used frequently in it. Let me share a couple of passages here. On the first day, the end of it, Genesis 1:4. And God saw the light that it was what? Good, right? The last day, Genesis 1:31. And God saw everything that he made, and behold, it was what? Very, very good. Now, the Hebrew word that is used there is the word tovi, and it's defined this way: having the qualities that make something useful and desirable. So here's what God does. God looks at creation and says, it's perfect, it's good, it's useful, it's desirable. Creation has a purpose. Now, what was that purpose? The purpose was to glorify God. But in the midst of this perfection and this goodness, something else is going on. God gives Adam power, right? Gives him authority. And he says, hey, here's the first thing I want you to do. You know, it's kind of chaotic. These animals don't know who they are, so you get to name them. So he's like, hey, why don't you make some structure out of the chaos? And so that's part of Adam's job. But the big part is just kind of hang out there and to take care of this garden, to oversee it. But in the midst of this time of overseeing this garden, Adam and Eve decide they want something different. That they want a different purpose for their lives. And what do? They began to define goodness on their own. Well, the next thing you know, you have God's goodness, and it seems to be at odds now with Adam and Eve's goodness. And so what does God do? God says, hey, this just isn't working. And so God kicks them out of this garden. See, God's goodness reflected God's purpose for the world. There was a purpose behind it. But here for Adam and Eve, their goodness reflected their own purposes for them. It created this tension. And God said, hey, you need to leave this place. But really, they're not any different than you and me, right? That's what we do. We determine our own goodness. We want to reflect our own purposes in our life like we see fit. That's why, again, if I said define goodness, we would have so many different definitions of what that is. But the reality is, the bigger part of this is so often our goodness is different than God's goodness. It looks different. And when our goodness is different than God's goodness, what does that lead to? Well, it leads to a fragmented world. It leads to a broken world, a messy world, all because we have this desire to live out our goodness and our purpose over God's goodness and God's purpose. But here's the beauty of God's goodness. God's goodness gives us hope in our brokenness. It brings with it this purpose, again, to transform and to change lives, because goodness is about restoration. It's about restoration. My dad was restoring cars. He got pretty excited about this for a time period. And these are 4 of them that he restored. That first one up in the top left is a 48 Ford. When he brought that thing in, I mean, it was still original. And so it was kind of cool to see that. But he did a lot of work on it, or paid somebody to do a lot of work on it, I should say. Put like a 67 Corvette engine in it. I mean, that thing would haul. On the right top corner there, Dad told me it was a 77 Bronco. Somebody else said, no, I don't think it is. I think it's a little earlier. I texted my dad. I was like, hey, Dad, you told me the wrong thing. He's like, I probably did. I don't remember. So somewhere between a 74 to 76 Bronco there. I'm sure he still wishes he had it because I think that thing was sold for about 3 times more than what he sold it for back in the day. Bottom left, that's a 67 Chevelle. I don't really remember that one. Bottom right, that is a 66 Chevy 2 SS. That's the first car my dad ever had, so he was pretty excited. That's not the same car. He actually totaled that one because he was a stupid teenager, was drunk, and somehow he lived. I don't know. He did that a couple times, but he wanted to have that car again, and so he restored one just like the one he had as a teenager. But he loved, or I should say loved, doing this type of thing. But here is my favorite car he ever restored. It's this one, a 65 Mustang Fastback 2+2. Now, some of you are like, that might be the worst photo I've ever seen of a prestigious car like that. Well, back in the day, we didn't have camera phones, okay? So we didn't, I was like, Dad, is that the best you guys? Like, yeah, that's all I got for you, buddy. So I loved this car. When he got it, it looked like a piece of trash, all right? And it even came, there was like pieces of it in boxes. And through a little bit of work he did and a lot of work some other people did, he restored this car. And again, it's probably my favorite car, right? I would love to have one of these. So just in case you have one and you're looking to get rid of it, I'm good. We can make a tax donation or something. I don't know. We'll figure it out. It's either that or like a 67 Corvette. Those are my two. But I told my dad, I was like, Dad, I love this car. And he's like, hey, don't worry. I'm going to keep it. Now, I'm not going to lie. There was a part of me back in that day that was like, maybe Dad will kick the bucket as soon as he finishes it, and I can just, have it, right? I never prayed that prayer. I just want to let you all know that. I never prayed that prayer. My dad's still alive. He's still kicking. I love him tremendously. But he told me, he was like, hey, I'm going to keep this car. I was like, that's great. And a week later, he sold it. And I'm still mad at him to this day. And I probably need to talk to my counselor about that, right? To get some help dealing with that. But what I loved about this is that I got to see this car at its worst. And then he restored it to its original beauty. That's what goodness is about. God's goodness is about restoration for you and me. It's restoring us back to the way things were for creation before brokenness set in. It's getting us back to that relationship that God intended for us to have with him. This is before you and I begin to define our goodness for ourselves. Restoration is about changed lives. It's about different people. It's about being new people. Tim Keller said this about goodness. He says, we aren't called to be nicer people. We are called to be new people. See, Paul's goodness isn't about us being nicer people. It's about being new people. It's about being changed people. And we can't be that when we're trying to live out our own goodness. We have to live out God's goodness. I love the way Al Walters, in his Creation Regained book, put it. He said, it is quite striking that virtually all of the basic words describing salvation in the Bible imply a return to an originally good state of situation. If you've been here at the Journey for any length of time, you've probably seen someone be baptized up here. And yes, that is a horse trough. And about 6 years ago, we put it up here on stage, and people are like, why do you have that? I'm like, man, it kind of puts us right in the middle of somebody being baptized, right? It doesn't feel like they're far off. They're like right here. But one of the things we invite people to do after they've been baptized here is we tell them to sign their name to this trough. And I love that part of this because each one of those names, it's somebody's story. It's somebody who matters to God. It's somebody who's saying, hey, I want to be restored back to God. I want to be restored back to creation in the way it was at the beginning. I want to be restored back into that relationship with God. I want God's goodness to be a part of who I am. I want to be this new person. And by the way, if you've never been baptized or you've been thinking about baptism, it's a huge part of our spiritual journey, and we'd love to have that conversation with you. You can go through the QR code there and the connection card that's on there, or the paper one that's in front of you, or you can just stop by our new here table out underneath the tent. We'd love to talk to you about what baptism is for us and what it looks like, but we'd love to talk about this restoration process that takes place, this act of baptism in our lives, that it makes us these new people. Paul actually writes this in Romans 6, "For we died and were buried with Christ by baptism. And just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glorious power of the Father, now we also may live new lives." New life is new creation in us. We are restored back to the goodness of what God intended for humanity. The goodness is all about restoration for us. The goodness reflects the purpose of God for the world. And we become these new people with new lives because of this purpose lived out through God's purposes. But when God's purposes are working and we're connected to that and we are restored, here's what goodness will do. Goodness will compel us to act. Last week we talked about kindness. Again, that's here in this passage in Galatians 5. I spent a lot of time on this message this week. This one was really hard. I spent like 4 straight days on it. And part of it is because, like, if you look at the word kindness and goodness, they're not too far apart. And so you might read kindness and see goodness, like, just do the same message you did last week, which I would have loved to have done, but I didn't do that. For your good and my good, because as I was looking at this and I was going back and looking at kindness really is pointing to this term goodness. It's not really a separate piece. It is saying, hey, there's kindness in who you are, right? Last week, we defined kindness this way. Kindness is unconditional love expressed towards others. In some ways, kindness is passive, okay? I said this last week. Kindness that Paul used here, it's the state of being. It's who we are. It's this characteristic that is a part of who we are. But this kindness really is, I think, pointing to this word goodness. And goodness takes that kindness a step further. Here's what I mean. John W. Rittenbaugh wrote this in his commentary on Galatians 5:22. He said, agathosune, again, that's that Greek word used for goodness, is therefore active, even aggressive goodness. It is more than an excellence of character. It is a character energized, expressing itself in active good. So that means if God's Spirit is working in us, it is producing this fruit in us that is this fruit of goodness that compels us to act. But here's the important part. It will compel us to act against the norms that are around us. A great example of this is the Good Samaritan. I find the Good Samaritan an interesting story that Jesus teaches because it actually is a story that people even who have no connection to the Christian church seem to know something about. And you probably know the story, and if you don't or you forgot parts of it, let me just kind of recap it. Quick little Cliff Notes, and I don't even know if they make Cliff Notes anymore, but Cliff Notes version of this right here. We have this guy, he's traveling, and he gets stopped, and he gets robbed, and he gets beaten, and he's left for dead. And the next thing you know, a priest comes by, priest looks over, sees this guy, thinks he's dead, and instead of checking on him to see if he's dead, he actually walks around the other side of the road. A little while later, a Levite comes through, and it does the exact same thing. This Levite comes through, sees this body, thinks this person is dead, doesn't go check on him, and then goes on the other side of the road. A little bit later, a Samaritan comes through, and the Samaritan sees this guy here, and he stops. Now, why did those other two guys stop? Well, they're all a part of the Jewish religious system at that time. And they knew the laws, right? They lived for the laws. They made people follow the laws. And the law says if you touch a dead body, right? They didn't go check, but they're just assuming if you touch a dead body, then there are all these rules and regulations that you had to go through to cleanse yourself so that you could kind of be back to normal again. And so they don't even look. They just kind of say, well, he's not moving, he's not breathing, he's not talking, nothing's happening. He must be dead. I'm just going to keep on going. The Samaritan comes through, sees the guy, and he stops. He doesn't just stop and give him a little kick, like see if he's still alive. No, he checks on him, and then he sees that he's still breathing, and he bandages him. And then he takes him and he puts him on his donkey, and he takes him to this inn. And when he gets to the inn, he tells the innkeepers, like, hey, I'm going to give you this money. And here's what I want you to do. I want you to take care of him. Continue to give him a place to stay. Continue to feed him. Continue to take care of the wounds that he has. Keep him here until he is restored. Keep him here until he is fully healthy. And he even says, here's the deal. I'm going to come back through here. And when I come back through, if it costs more than the money I gave you, you know what? I'll pay for whatever it took to take care of this man. I mean, that's going against the norms of that culture in that day. But here's what's important to know about this story. And there's many different things we could talk about with it, but the guy who is laying there left for dead was Jewish. The priest who walks through is Jewish. The Levite who comes through is Jewish. The Samaritan is not Jewish. And in that culture, you would think the Levite or the priest would stop to help someone of their own kind, right? That's the only way I could really say it. And that was Jewish just like them. And yet the Samaritan comes through and he stops and he helps him. And in that culture, that wasn't the norm. If anybody should have walked through and walked past, it should have been the Samaritan. But the Samaritan didn't care, right? The Samaritan sees somebody in need. The Samaritan has God's goodness in him, and he's showering that on this guy. He goes against the culture. He goes against the norm of that day to care for someone in need. Again, he showed God's goodness through his actions. But that's what God's goodness should do for us. It should compel us to act. And I'm not talking about walking a little old lady across a busy street. And I'm not talking about, like we said last week, buying the person behind me their coffee when I'm in the drive-thru line at a Starbucks. I'm talking about living out God's goodness means we are going to do some difficult things. We're going to have some difficult conversations. We're going to have those with parents or friends or siblings or coworkers, and oftentimes this is because of some spiritual matter that is there, that they've made poor decisions, and we are trying to help them move forward because they're hurting themselves or they're hurting others. Or maybe for us, we're setting up boundaries. That there's someone who's hurting other people, and you just have to say, hey, we need to set up boundaries. And I'm setting up these boundaries with you because this is going to be good for you, and this is going to be good for us. But we've got to set these boundaries in place. And man, that's a difficult conversation to have with people that maybe we know and love and care for. Or maybe that difficult conversation is standing up for someone else that maybe doesn't have the power to do that. That's what God's goodness compels us to do. And it compels us to act, and sometimes that means having difficult conversations. Or it means taking difficult actions. Could be helping out someone that no one else would help out. Or being present for someone that nobody else would be present for. Stepping up and fighting for those who can't fight for themselves. And here's a big one. This will challenge you. Maybe it means protecting others even if their definition of good is different than God's definition of good. Because guess what? We're still called to love them and to be there for them and to help them, maybe even protect them. All the while, we're praying that God's goodness will change them and transform them and maybe restore them back to what God intended for all of us. Like, that's the way of the Good Samaritan. He wasn't worried about the rules and the laws and the lines and the boundaries and the norms of the day. He stepped out of that and did something very, very difficult. Why? Because he saw someone who needed it. And because of God's goodness, I believe in him, he was able to help this person in need. And in the end, was able to help restore life back to them. We talked about this last week, this passage out of Romans 12. Again, Paul writes this. He says, don't let evil conquer you, but conquer evil by doing good. Our world is broken, and it is fragmented, and it is messy, especially when all of us are defining good for ourselves. all that does, it just makes the world more broken, more fragmented, and more messy. And so it's easy for us to let that goodness that we've defined for ourselves take over, right? And I'll just be honest, that could be evil. But we're not called to be evil. We're called to conquer evil by doing good. And God's goodness will compel us to act and sometimes compel us to do difficult things to show others the goodness of God, to help people be restored back to God. Which means that goodness is being the light in the world. Last summer, there was the Van Gogh experience. It was in downtown D.C. I don't know if anybody had a chance to go there and see that. It was pretty amazing. Kara and I had a day off and went down there and spent a few hours. And it's all about the life of Van Gogh, right? So it's like sights and sounds. And they would take his paintings, and there's this one room, everything's moving. I mean, it's a lot, but at the same time, it was just impressive what they were able to do. But another part of this experience, you got to walk around and see his paintings and to read his story, and it's a fascinating story. But you probably are familiar with one of his most famous paintings. It's this one right here, Starry Night. It's a masterpiece, right? I mean, I think most of us would probably say that it's known as a masterpiece. I should say that. But just kind of look at the vibrant colors that are there, the different hues of blue and the yellow and the white, and then even the green, and then the strokes of his brush, and just sort of the image that's there. It's not necessarily clean, right? But there's something just beautiful about it. But this isn't just a painting. In the midst of this painting, Van Gogh is trying to tell us something. If you focus in to the middle of the painting, there's a church. And it's almost like central to this whole painting that's there, right? This image that he has created. And if you look around it, you see all these homes and there's lights that are on. But look at the church. It's dark. No lights are on in that church. And it's known that Van Gogh had some pretty big issues with the church. And in fact, in this painting, he's saying the church is a dark place. The church is full of dark people, right? It's not the place that it's supposed to be. It's not a light into the world. But when we are living God's goodness out, we will be a light in the world, a light that shines through you and me. Like Jesus even preaches about this in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5. You're the light of the world, like a city on a hilltop that cannot be hidden. No one lights a lamp and then puts it under a basket. Instead, a lamp is placed on a stand where it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your good deeds shine out for all to see, so that everyone will praise your heavenly Father. If we're a follower of Jesus, we're called to be light. But it's not just us as individuals, right? This church community, we are called to be a light. This place is not supposed to be dark. This church community is not supposed to be a place where we keep all the light inside this building. No, we are called to be a light into the world. And when we are living out God's goodness in our lives, because God's Spirit is transforming us and changing us, then we will be that light to a darkened world. For what purpose? So more and more people can know who Jesus is. And so that more and more people can live out the purpose of God's goodness by glorifying God. But that's only going to happen when God's Spirit is leading us and moving us and guiding us. Because that will create God's goodness in us, and we will be that light shining in a broken and fragmented and messy world. And so if we say we are followers of Jesus, we are called to be light. And God's goodness allows us to be that light in the world. I love what Paul writes in 1 Thessalonians 1:11. He says, so we keep on praying for you, asking our God to enable you to live a life worthy of this call. May he give you the power to accomplish all the good things your faith prompts you to do. This term good that is used here in 1 Thessalonians 1:11, it is actually that same Greek word that we find in Galatians 5. And so as we kind of put these two together, if we were people, this type of goodness, right? If I'm not defining goodness for myself, if you're not defining goodness for yourself, if they're not defining goodness for themselves, but we are living out God's goodness in the world, we will live out its purpose. And by doing so, we will see more and more people restored back to God. And the reason is because you and I will be light. We'll be compelled to act in this life because of what God is doing in us and through us. And so as we finish up this morning, may God give us the power to accomplish all the good things God's Spirit prompts us to do. And that in the end, we can fully glorify God.